Welcome to this dialogue, this kind of exploratory podcast. I'm Rufus Pollock. I'm one of the co-founders of Life Itself, and here's my great friend and collaborator and co-founder Liam, who's also the director of the Climate Majority Project. Hey, Liam, welcome.
Hey Rufus, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah,
We're
we've
gonna
been
we're
talking
gonna
about doing this for a long time, so this is doing a bit of a periodic podcast. So this is the first one.
Yeah. So how would you like to start? We were saying maybe starting from talking about the origins of kind of our collaboration. Well, it goes back a long way, but particularly around life itself and this kind of this area of metamodernism, the second Renaissance, integral, teal, whatever we weren't calling that initially. But next paradigm approach. Yeah, do you want to, should we start there?
Yeah, I think we've had. So it's one of these things. The labels always come last, right? Like people were doing sustainability for a long time before the moniker sustainability kind of stuck to the group of people who were doing sustainability. But I think in many ways our friendship maintained itself when we were in different countries for over a decade, largely because of a shared sense of like something big needed to change and would change, and that it involved a deep change in mindset, as opposed to simply something kind of political or economic or technological, but that there's a deep mindset change that was necessary and almost inevitable in uh, the industrialized world, and that it actually needed to be consciously catalyzed, because basically we don't. Well, I think the timelines on which when we originally started talking about this, it was could take a very long time, and things are impossible to time. Uh,
Yes.
and around the time that we started Life Itself was the time when both of us looked up and said, you know what, I actually think this is the time. I think this transition period that we know is like inevitable in some ways is showing real signs of coming in our lifetime. So we should drop everything we're doing and we should work on that.
Yes, and this just for people, it's like life itself started in 2015, 2016, and we met in 21 or so, 22 years ago now. And so, yeah, exactly. There was this sense of like we already could see in the 2000s or before that there was something kind of deeply the matter, deeply not working. But as you say, it could be that way for quite a while. And I'm always big on the historical analogies. Before Protestantism happened, there was a lot of rot in the kind of institutional system of Christendom. The Catholic Church was kind of rotting a bit from within, but it took a couple of centuries before that manifested in Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And often, like calling the market in finance, people can often say, oh, we're in a bubble, but calling when the bubble ends or calling that kind of stuff is very hard. But there was a
I
sense
mean,
that,
example would be like dollar devaluation, right? So right now people are talking about the dollar collapsing and that there may be a huge financial crisis. I'm not saying that won't happen in the next year, but it's on the news again, right? But people have been also talking about the fact that the dollar is unsustainable and that when the dollar loses its reserve currency status, stops being the currency everybody around the world uses to make trades, that this will have all sorts of far-ranging effects. But I remember getting articles about this in the early 2000s that were, very well argued and talking about how it was going to happen soon. Andre Gunder Frank, the naked hegemon, right, in around the United States. But these things take who knows when the timing comes, right? Uh,
yes, like an avalanche. And the point, though, was that we were sensing, and in a way, coincidentally, the first Life Itself major gathering was in summer 2016. And obviously, Brexit and the election of Trump, which I think for many people, when I now talk to them, are often certainly Trump and other things in the Western world, whatever they think of them, are this kind of major point of something shifted, and that there was this awareness, and that happened in the autumn of 2016. So yeah, I mean, I'd love you to say a bit more also about, because I think you're often very perspicacious on about this, of like what you'd also been doing a lot of work in climate already at that point, and sustainability and the coming crisis, the ecological breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've been very interested in it, and this was for a long time, and I always followed the climate news, and so part of the shift for me was talking to people at Scripps Institute. So I did a PhD in University of California, San Diego, in cognitive science. It's one of the only cognitive science programs in the world devoted. I basically did a PhD on embodied collective cognition. Embodied cognition among the human superorganism is probably the way that I would define my research at UCSD. But I followed climate news the whole time I was there and talked with climate scientists. The Scripps Institute is part of UCSD, and we would have kind of Friday pints at Scripps, a lot of the graduate students. And, then I would ask the climate scientists, like, tell me how, really, like, how bad is it? And around the time that while I was at UCSD, was this time at which the climate dialogue started shifting, right? That the news started to turn, right? A lot of the stuff that you hear people like Johan Rockström talking about now, about um, planetary tipping points, the need to keep things under 1.5, and all of that started bubbling up to the surface. And then climate became a not like next century problem, and just degradation generally, but much more of a current problem. And I think that also for me was a tell, as a person who studied emotion and cognition, right? People know this term cognitive dissonance now, right? It's become pretty widespread conversation. I was fascinated by it from the moment I ran into it in undergraduate, and had long thought like, well, scientists aren't immune to this. Institutions aren't immune to this. What's the actual state of fragility? What are the actual accumulating stresses on our system? And and it's also this thing that, yeah, the sudden appearance of much worse than uh, thought global warming and global warming consequences is kind of a sign of resistance, right? There's some element of people just being surprised, I think, legitimately, because there's less, like the Earth has less of a tendency to regulate itself than people thought. It might have been quite reasonable to think that the Earth was very good at like somehow offsetting massive influxes of uh, CO2. But that was basically kind of a theory. It also could have been seen as a relatively fragile equilibrium, right, where we were at. That would be a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. It just wasn't something people were embracing. It turns out to be basically the truth. That's what people like Rockstrom, the Potsdam Institute, think right now. And that's the way that climate science has been going, and sustainability science has been going. And that there's a wider sense at which similar strains in society were probably being ignored. And for me, there was a widespread dissatisfaction after 2008, and yeah, Trump is this turning point where you kind of feel like you're in a shaky house and there's signs of things that are not right, but then you suddenly hear a really like creak,
Yeah.
deep
I think
cracking noise.
exactly. I mean, I think there's a couple of things I want to draw out there in terms of the way we've thought about things and that are out there. I think one which is a component of relates to cognitive dissonance. What I'm saying is there's certain features of how we humans tend to think. The other, one is about cognitive dissonance, which just, if we're listening, is the fact that it's difficult to hold two conflicting kind of ideas in your mind. And one of the interesting facts is we tend to therefore dismiss things that are not convenient. So let's say I'm a smoker and I'm a doctor and I know all about the danger of smoking. I can either quit smoking or I can somehow suppress my knowledge or kind of like, oh, I won't get lung cancer. It will be someone else or something else like that.
Yeah.
And for example, it's a painful thought to think that things might go really wrong with the climate. So there's a tendency for us to kind of cognitive distance to sort of suppress the information we're being given because it's uncomfortable at some quite deep level. I think another point that I would like to bring in is about um, non-linearities. And I just think the easiest thing to think about this is things like avalanches. I think this is really relevant to a lot of things that we're going to discuss or you are already discussing. So the classic thing in an avalanche is that even if, let's say, snow is accumulating constantly, it's not like avalanches are constant. What happens is snow builds up and builds up and builds up, even if it's, as I said, the amount of snow that's arriving is at the same rate per hour. And then there's a point when the avalanche happens because it hits some tipping point.
Right.
And these are things we understand with avalanches, but even the fact that we're so freaked out by avalanches, um, I think is a reference to the fact that we don't really cope with nonlinearities very well. We normally expect that we apply something constantly and something constant happens. We put our foot on the accelerator of the car and a constant rate in the car constantly gets a bit faster. And things which have these uh, sudden shifts are, we're aware of them, but they're not well suited to human cognition for whatever reason.
Well, there's a reason we can talk about that, right? So the reason why I think is basically now. So this is for math. All mathematicians know that locally curves tend to be linear, right? So if we take a
Yes,
circular curve and we zoom in on the most local scale of things, all trends get to be linear, right? You take any graph in math class, you keep on going, you know, further and further and further into one point, you see something that looks like a line. Right.
right.
And we prefer to live in a linear world because it's predictable. That's what niche seeking is, right? So the thing is that when you're basically a niche seeker, right? Or a niche constructor, even, right, as a species, then you tend to like basically want to find predictable things, right? So one way you can look at humans is that they're essentially trying to find niches in which things are predictable. We're kind of not made to be steering the entire planet. We haven't been doing that. What we've instead been doing is seeking out safe niches where things are linear. And that's actually what our minds want to grasp onto, right? Versus like actually wanting to look at things in a non-linear way, uh, is, that's very interesting, but who the hell wants to live in a non-linear niche?
Right, exactly. And I mean, you see this just to make a pop culture reference, the Dark Forest series and the idea of a planet which lives in a chaotic system where there's three planets and things can go terribly wrong suddenly. I think I think it's also the point that the zooming in point is also really good. It's not only that we seek that, it's that a lot of human history, because of the timescale in which things changed around us versus the timescale of a human life, and even the kind of memory scale of much of human society, we didn't see many nonlinear events. It's like if you are on a mountain, you actually don't see many avalanches. They happen quite rarely relative to the amount it snows. So there's just humans haven't seen many nonlinear events that are in living memory.
Not consequential ones, right? So we see things like clouds, for example, right? Or like airstreams, where those are extremely nonlinear, but not consequential ones, right? So that's how you think about niche,
Earthquakes, or yeah, the things we think
right?
about avalanche earthquakes are rare relatively.
Well, and if there were places in which avalanches were frequent, humans would not be in them, right? So that's called an inhospitable climate, right?
Yes.
So and this is the thing, like the tops of huge mountains would have highly nonlinear, climates in a lot of ways, right? There's a huge amount of turbulence. It's not particularly a place people want to live, right? constantly windswept islands. They're lightly populated generally, right? The places where people gravitate towards are the ones where there are
Stable.
highly predictable conditions, right? I mean,
California, it's 26 degrees every day of the year or whatever, LA. And the thing is, I want to make a connection here because there's a connection between that and what we're talking about the emergence of awareness and about embodied collective connect, embodied collective cognition. Because what I'm trying to get at is that what we also say is that also applies to basically views, because views the way what we think about the world and like what we imagine is happening, and even our awareness of nonlinearity, for example, or cognitive dissonance, these things also follow sort of nonlinear patterns in populations, in that there's kind of contagion and tipping points. So, for example, even though for quite a while you or I or other people might be like, wow, there's something going on. There's either a sense of, well, we can't do anything, not enough other people really share our view. And so there's this, what I'm also trying to get at is that going back to the kind of origin story of life itself, is there's these moments when there are sudden shifts,
yeah.
like sudden avalanches in opinion, and one can sense that sort of coming, like and that was something that we were starting to sense, that
Well,
given
exactly.
what's
See, people are
happening to the planet and so on, that there was going to be it was going to happen faster than we maybe thought. I read The Collapse of Complex Societies by Tainter at university in 2000. I was reading books on how many people can the Earth support. I was like, hey, this stuff doesn't really add up of the logic of where we're going. But in a way, someone who's ahead of their time is a madman or a prophet. It's like, what's the point of going and getting concerned about it if there's no one else to work with? And so that shift we felt was starting to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's this thing that there's a taboo about it in the 90s, or this weird things get out in art because I mean, there's a few things to talk about there. One, I mean, maybe to go back to one point about general cognition to kind of set the table as well for the science nerds amongst us, and this will probably be a fairly nerdy discussion, and that's great. I think we do need depth on these subjects, right? So part of the thing about cognitive dissonance, right? So what people kind of usually use cognitive dissonance to like explain weird results, right? But what they miss is like, your brain's a dissonance machine. That's why you have dissonance reduction machine or a consistency finding machine. In many ways, that's why you have this tendency towards confirmation bias because it's consistent with what you already know. And you're basically you can say looking for places in which your ideas work or your habits work. That's what a niche finder does, right? So you're basically looking for places in which the mindset that you've already constructed can be successful, right? That's what people do on jobs. It's what they do, when they try and find their place, their role in life, right? And when you've invested in a worldview and you've adopted a worldview, there tends to be an attachment to a worldview because worldviews work. They're the means by which you kind of arrive at reward or good feelings, right? So I always say, this is one of the Buddha's great um, sort of ideas was that, well, you're not really addicted to an orange, you're addicted to the feeling tones of an orange, right? So, why are we addicted to ideas? Because ideas do stuff for us. We're used to using them and then getting this immediate result, like the light bulb effect that you get, or the feeling of a good conclusion, or the results economically, or being able to buy lots of nice things at the supermarket that result from using those ideas successfully. Your brain keeps track of when your viewpoint is working. And the more it works, the more kind of reward you get, the more pleasure you get out of using your worldview, the more attached you are to it, right? And so whatever it is, regardless of the uh, veracity, the truth of the kind of, say American capitalist worldview, for people who are living inside a, American capitalist system, it works, at least locally, right? And then, there's a certain point when we know from science, ideas often stop working, but people are very attached to them because they've become reality, right? When you're reality is impossible to distinguish from just ingrained habits of perception. Things feel real when you expect, your brain has an expectation, and then the signals that it gets from reality, the perceptions, the perceptual input is consistent with that. expectation that creates a sense of reality, right? And so inside the system that we'd created, we have a mindset that is like adapted to that system, and the system feels very real because it's very regular. So it all, and that is the kind of our evolutionary signal of that our ideas and our viewpoint is working in our niche, right? However, all the things you're talking about with sustainability science says that niche eventually is going to undermine its own self to keep those, to reward those ideas, that worldview, right? They're going to stop working and stop creating these rewarding feedbacks. And at that point, people are going to give them up, right? They'll be threatened because they aren't working. And it'll be, especially like quite old people for those ideas have been working very well for a long time will have a very difficult time. But young people, especially, right, this is part of the reason probably why we don't live forever because you want people who aren't attached to old perspectives in a non-linear macro environment, right? In the big scale of history, things are non-linear. So you want like new people coming along with new ideas who get attached to new, more apt perspectives. Just seems to be how it works, right? And this thing that, yeah, we're getting to this point where the writing was on the wall with limits to the growth, which is if you actually read it properly, they weren't saying it's going to happen exactly this year. They were saying like we're outside of the bounds of what we can support. This system cannot keep on rewarding you forever. It cannot keep on delivering uh, reward to the same habits that we have now forever. I mean, the things that you discussed with Tainter, I think, Tainter is a more sophisticated version of that. But yeah, and then Trump comes along and it's like, right, people have noticed this now. They've noticed that um, basically the system we're living in is not really working. It hasn't been working for a very long time. And now people are so cynical about it that they're voting for somebody who just feels like he can make change happen, right? That was, the obvious thing with Trump is like, for me, you're sitting there watching somebody who is like obviously a crazy narcissist. He couldn't stop talking about how great he was, even though that would be very, very helpful for him to just sound a little bit more presidential, a little bit less crazy. If he could, sometimes show a glint of humility here and there, but he was just obviously incapable of it, right? Like anybody would say, like, well, he'd come off across better. There's a much more dangerous version of Trump, which is like capable of affecting humility sometimes, right? But he's just he's not even capable of doing that, and yet people are still voting for him because he's not what they're used to, right? And he did a lot of other good things that we could talk about, but that is like, wow, this is a sign of post 2008 world that people are really have lost faith in institutions in the United States. That means that the kind of global order that the US is a linchpin of, at the very least, is going to start falling apart. And then what, right? So
Yes. I mean, I think that was, yeah, that's a great thing in the classic phrase that the the character in Chinese for um crisis has this like danger and opportunity. And I think there was a sense, I'm not sure we were so explicit about that, but I think what was clear was that for me at least, I think for both of us, but was that this kind of there was this need in a change in worldview and consciousness. I think there was, certainly we were both, for example, in the sustainability area, even in the mid 2010s, though it was changing rapidly after several failures at COP. But there was a sense of like, well, we can still sort it out, or green, the Green New Deal or other things. Whereas I think certainly from my perspective and our perspective was like, wow, there's something deeper. There's something deep and rotten in the state of Denmark. There's something that's going to have to shift at this deeper level. And going back to Trump was this sense of like, there are these moments where it's like, yeah, there's a spreading sense that something's the matter. Rather than it's kind of, it's not great, but the plane's having some turbulence, but it's going to ride itself. When suddenly you're like, no, there's no one in the pilot's cabin. The pilot's jumped out the plane or whatever. There's a moment of spreading understanding. I think where we were also was that while I think that's continued to increase in the last decade, there's still a paucity of clarity, I would say, on the diagnosis, at least that we had. We were like, okay, as we're saying here, what's the source of the problem? Picking whether you pick it in, um, climate and ecological area or other areas like how we're managing technology in general, what we're focused on as society, which was this is in this kind of deep consciousness worldview end of things, and the need for new ways of enabling collective action.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's the real.
What do you do? That's the great like what great. What's your diagnosis of this illness? We noticing that you've got symptoms now, metaphorically. We know that the patient's got a temperature, the plane's got problems, the building's foundations are shaking, but what is really the problem and what can we do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, then there's two. There's the proximate problem, which is that nobody feels like they can do anything about it. And then there's the kind of, the ultimate problem of a system, which is just, there's something, as we say, deeply the matter, and this has come to be known as a meta crisis, right? So, we didn't have that word at the beginning, but the thought that essentially there was something deeply wrong with essentially our priorities, and you can say worldview, but also, essentially our being, our actual ways of being, because a worldview is also a product of what type of feelings you're addicted to, right? So people who are, the world's mystics are not addicted to views, right? They're kind of if you're good at living in mystery, our wisdom traditions that most of the world had kind of counseled this ability to dwell in mystery, which also means not being addicted to one view of reality, versus if you're very interested in doing and obsessed with doing accomplishments and having, then you're addicted to views because views are the ways that we do things and have things, create material possessions. So that kind of historical imbalance that none of our wisdom traditions would have recognized as wise was, very deeply at the heart of capture by capitalism, capture by material standards. And, we should probably remark here, right? So people hearing capitalism, I don't get, we haven't, when you look back at what we said, we haven't been stridently anti-capitalist because, part of the problem with communicating on capitalism is that when people hear, criticisms of capitalism, they hear socialism and they hear, um, dispensing with markets, right? And it's very difficult to, to talk about the fact that, like, look, we aren't going to get rid of people taking things, making them better and then selling them on again. Like people, coming up with ideas about how they could create value for other people and then selling their things to other people. That's the basis of a market. Markets have been with us for a very long time. Capitalism is about the cultural priority that's given to
Mm,
profits and material possessions, right? That essentially, as I put it in my Life Itself working paper, which became a book, that was published through Perspectiva Press eventually, right? One of our collaborators. Um, the what really happens, it's like the values of the merchant society, which would have would have been considered sort of foreign. I mean, present, but not considered the thing that you wanted in charge of your society, not like the values of the merchant class, as kind of the guiding values of your society. Was not historically what we wanted, and that's what we're at now. It's like, something all of our wisdom traditions would have considered unwise, which we then decided was basically, oh, there's something wrong with the wisdom traditions. They're, just kind of giving opiates to the masses. Whereas, I don't think the wisdom traditions necessarily said all of them be poor. There are some that said that. There are some that said, just live in poverty. But there's another sense of like, well, it's just not supposed to, it's not really a wise priority to have put that as the most important thing,
Yes.
And that showed up. That was obviously showing up in the 90s, right? Like people already had enough, and it wasn't making them happy. And we say, when was the rot showing? Well, it was also there in the 90s. Like I might urge anybody to just go, now or at the end of listening to this, do yourself a favor and go and like look at Smashing Pumpkins' Bullet with Butterfly Wings. This is like, number one song in the United States. And I remember it very well. They were from Chicago, the same city, where I'm from. And, it opens up with this lyric, "The world is a vampire." Right? Come to drain. And then the familiar chorus, "Despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage." Right? Over
Yeah.
and over and over again. The like this savage nihilism of the grunge era, which is like, adults would look at it and be like, wow, that's what the kids are into, and just kind of look the other direction. I remember it very
Yes.
clearly, right? Being in this like the middle of it, and kind of adults kind of like staring at us, like, so you're getting into mosh pits and running into each other at high velocity and listening to this music and over again. And like this is where we're at,
Yeah.
right? But and they would just sort of like look at it and then turn their head and be like, it's a phase or something. Like, no, it wasn't a phase. It was, early signs of disaffection. It comes out in this like sanctioned art space where we just are free to do crazy, irrational things and then pretend that they didn't mean anything. And kind of move on with life and you know uh then go be normal. They show up there first, right? But they were really clear in the 90s. Like just look at the art of the 90s. It's it's mind-blowing. With like kind of like we have been doing this inner work and resensitization, I think, as a culture recently. And if you just go and stare at that stuff from the
Yeah.
height of the jaded, alienated 90s that we could just look at without being uh really hit by it, it's like it's wow. It's pretty
Yes.
crazy.
Radiohead. I mean, I remember the feeling in myself, like the sense of nihilism and despair. I mean, I remember writing an essay for my school when I was 17, uh, that just really said this. And I think also the despair, like I think there was this double despair for me because I was quite enamored of the 60s. So I read a lot about the 60s and, the hope. And there was this also, I felt this kind of like, why? I remember reading a book about the revolution in the head, which is about the Beatles records in the 60s. And it kind of ends with like, something about like, why do we love their records so much? Because on the other side of the chasm, they're there smiling, but we're here now. Like it was kind of like we couldn't go back. There had been this golden moment of like, of I think hope about like transcending modernity, and it's like probably moments we went back where people thought they'd get out of the corrupt Catholic Church at the end of the Middle Ages, but it took another 100 and something years and a breakdown. I think I just remember the sadness and despair in me, and a real sense of um, the moral nihilism. And the one thing which also in me was that I was sort of committed, um, in a way, to a sort of rationalism, to my intellect, and I
Mm.
couldn't find an argument for my friends of why we shouldn't destroy beautiful things. Like I remember a friend of mine ripping apart this rose in front of me when I was about 16 or 17, in his garden. I said, "Well, why did you do that?" He was like, kind of grinned at me. He was like, "Why not?" It's like, why shouldn't we just this nihilism? And
Mm.
I think that the thing that I felt in my heart was I felt this for me. I wasn't at all religious, but something that was like there is a good, and I don't know. I think but that aspect, again, in historical terms, I think of the actual original nihilists in Russia in the 19th century and others. So it was a recognition of something very strong. And as you say, I think the thing that I was also, just to say personally, I think was on a quest was almost since those times where I was very present. I was extremely depressed. I was really like, what is the purpose of life? There is no, I wasn't being reassured by reading Sartre and existentialism, Camus was on a quest in a weird way. to also find a purpose and a good again. And then somehow, in a way, I should actually say, I think that's part of what I've been in art, tech, and life itself is both seeing this, there's this kind of opportunity to give one's life to something which is a kind of renewal of a society. And coming from a Buddhist place where maybe certainly in my younger years made things very wrong, made people wrong about, made maybe not capitalism, but communism, but just like, what were we doing? What were we doing to ourselves? What were we doing when we had a world where we would destroy a flower, where we had no sense of beauty anymore, where people would just say, well, why? Why shouldn't I vandalize this or not? You know, I had friends who, when I was growing up, it became common, and it wasn't a reflection even on then. We were in a world in the late 90s where people would vandalize things. I remember watching Larry Clark's Kids, and adults were writing these articles about like Larry Clark's Kids is this shocking movie about, you know, these teenagers who are having sex, and one of them is get diagnosed with AIDS, and he still has sex with a girl who's kind of drunk at a party. And I was like, that didn't literally happen, but I was seeing behavior people would, that, and you're reading Bret Easton Ellis, and you're just like, dude,
Knocking
this
over
is
gravestones.
saturation, but this is not far off the kind of rudderlessness sense we have.
I mean, the kind of like the amount of I had friends in high school or acquaintances, like to vandalize graveyards. We had one kid who was just sat near an overpass and threw rocks into oncoming cars.
Yeah, and it was just, and the thing I'm getting at was that, at least for me, obviously, one way was to go back. I'd grown up in a sort of atheist family, but the moral majority, we could go back, and that never called me. And the question was, what was a path forward? And I guess why I'm still saying this is because this is a context, I think, for what's emerging, both why we started with others like Life Itself, our tech, but also what's happening in the world, which is I think there's this has, in the least the Western world, that was a sort of nadir, and in a way, the irony is the recognition is maybe coming too late for regarding the environment and various other things. I mean, there's still others who still want to rush forward in a way. It's just we need more. But maybe I should kind of come forward if like, then what do we do? This was what we were, I guess, the question, what is to be done was the question we were asking ourselves as well. And
Yeah, yeah.
what did you started to think? What are we thinking now? I mean, I guess that's a point to come towards is like, what was our diagnosis and what was the prognosis that was motivating us at life itself? And you just said one thing is hope. Just at the beginning, people are either cynical or despairing by default today, often. You know,
Yeah, well, or ironic, right? So I mean, I think to complete the arc of the cultural shift that one saw, right? You had the '90s, which was nihilistic, and then you had the Audis, which the hipster. I moved to New York and saw firsthand like the rise of hipsterdom, and kind of my first jobs, right? So it was this incredible, like ironization of everything, where one lives in the this life one doesn't believe in, which was formerly had one in nihilism, right? So if you kind of like look at the idealism of this attractive idealism of the late 60s, and you stare at the world that you're supposed to live in the 90s, that fills some it can fill you with nihilism, but an easier route is to be ironic about it, kind of enjoy the pleasures, the capitalist pleasures that are available to you, but kind of also don't really connect with it emotionally. You put this glaze of irony all over everything, and kind of preserve your sanity that way, which is basically what the hipster aesthetic was. And then there's this kind of new sincerity, right? So the kind of like sense though is like, look, we're ultimately this isn't going to work. We need some type of to be something to be really sincere and heartfelt about, to have a connection to the future, right? And however, I think there's several things here, right? It's that opens up when this the solidity of the thing that makes one first nihilistic then ironic starts to dissipate, right? So this is for me, it's like this modern movement. We don't strongly connected enough to look. Postmodernism was called by Frederick Jameson the cultural logic of late capitalism. I think the dynamic that I was describing there. Jameson was one of the first people to like hint at it very well. It's very academic, much more academic than my description just now. But then there's this sense of like, okay, but if we don't think this is inevitable, then there's a chance for moral sincerity to return again.
Mhm.
And for me, the only thing worth doing is to be part of, however long it takes. I think we can at least sense that the end of history has not happened. uh, People are not, and even if one was one of the never convinced by that, we can also be convinced that other people aren't convinced. There's a tendency we can live in a, the point for me is to tell yourself a potentially self-fulfilling prophecy. Not all prophecies, right? This is part of the things where political romantics and political people who get into politics confuse themselves that there's this pure romance view of politics, and it's like, no, not self-fulfilling every prophecy is potentially self-fulfilling. Some are, right? Your job is to essentially find a self-fulfilling prophecy and then tell yourself that, prophecy, right? And for a group of people, it doesn't need to be an individual thing. Collectively, how do we live in a prophecy that can fulfill itself, right? That's just called a good plan, right? But
Yeah.
it needs a moral sense. We need, an active cultivation of a concern for people in the future, and for meaning, right? Which is, meaning is just essentially like our sense of the significance of our actions for others, right? Which we have an innate sense of. We have an innate sense of like what is going to happen to other people, how our actions will kind of ripple through the worlds of others, and if we can actually live in a meaningful future or meaningful narrative, then that's a great thing. And we can do that. I think, it is possible to see that the faith in this worldview that we have is not permanent. It is getting undermined. One can invest oneself in a dream of the future, and not need it to come true in one's lifetime, but still find
Yes.
that like noble
Help
ambition.
it manifest. Yes, that it can that even is part of the worldview to do things for a time scale that is not normally considered today. I've got a couple of questions. I think one thought I want to mention is a motto that I think was something you coined, but I feel is a one of the mottos of for me and for life itself and for art tech, which is what we were called when we started, which is we believe together. And
Yeah.
obviously, a bad part of that, that, in a sense, but really people far overestimate in modernity how much they're an individual, how much they have their own. And so this point was that faith in this future, the faith in what we even describe now, the possibility that there can be profound change. We can move from the kind of worldview of modernity or post-modernity that we find ourselves in, of materialism, scientism, reductionist rationalism, endless growth, material growth, and so on. Which there's that. Not to say there was not value in many of those things, but go beyond it. Take the good things from that and go beyond it to reintroduce the mystical, to reintroduce the ideas of wisdom, the idea that there is moral value, for example, which has become relativized and so on. But we have to believe together. It's extremely difficult to believe on your own, particularly, and that's why we also, I think, relates to the point of the self-fulfilling prophecy. There are things where when you believe them together, they can become real, whereas there are other things that don't have that feature. And so this aspect was a key part, that even to start with, even a few dozen people or people who are in regular contact but who share these beliefs is a very powerful thing. And then that could expand. One could start to see the beginnings of a movement, and even the vanguard of a movement of people who believe together,
Yeah.
uh, that even in small groups to start with. So, just to even speak for myself, I'd seen these things in my teens, I'd seen them in my 20s, and yet I'd gone out in a way, even though I and you stayed in touch, I'd ended up back in kind of a conventional role. I'd become a research fellow at University of Cambridge and done my PhD. in things I didn't really believe in that much. I mean, they were useful and interesting, but they were definitely within the system. So I was very present personally by 2015 when we started, of like the need to find others, even if it wasn't like everyone in the world, even if it was just five other people. And that was the beginning. And then there's a question of like what is to be done. And what we wrote in 2017 in ICQH, or our kind of purpose, we said there's this growing intuition that something is deeply the matter, that despite so much material progress, we are not truly satisfied, happy, and at peace. There is a fear of the future, a lack of visionary hope, and we distrust ourselves as a species and our capacity to manage our world wisely. As the world has become more complex and intertwined, it requires patience, rigor, qualitative observation, emotional honesty, deep thinking, creative application, and collective action. And very few groups do that. And this other point, which we had in the complication, was that there's a distrust of big visions, of any solution that isn't material or technological. Bold and powerful visions of the future are subject to knee jerk dismissal or destructive debate, which prevents their proposal and realization. We need a breakthrough in individual and collective being, but a breakthrough here is hard as it requires a consensus on foundational values and views, including belief in the possibility of transformation, hope, and the nature and primacy of being. And this was leading us to say, well, like we need a vision. You need a vision, and you need to, and that vision incorporates this aspect of the need to have collective action, and even a faith again in politics, which was something that not politics in the big P sense of like party politics, but the fact of
Right.
acting together for shared goals, the fact of having shared vision for
Yeah.
society, so on. And that was the question, was then how do we begin? So do you want to talk a little bit about that, and I guess also the shortcut question, and what the thesis that we had and we have, or we continue to evolve, of how this comes about. How does how do we address, and building on this fact that there was this kind of opening up of gap, that there was the Overton window, the thing that was considered possible was shifting as Trump, maybe it was very, well, maybe very critical of Trump, but what I'm saying is that moment of election, people started being, wow, something's up here. Ordinary, much broader group of people after that and various other things that were happening was like, wow, this building, the foundations are much less solid than we think. Maybe it's time to examine the foundations. And that opens up possibility for much more profound change.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think so. I mean, there's kind of like a f impulse for me, like fast forward in a way.
Yes.
There's because there's a slow break where essentially people know that, okay, a small percentage of people at first, and which has been growing, have started to gravitate towards a subculture. I think we were one of the first organizations that I saw that was really aimed at this subculture, but which we can call now, we can call it meta modernity. A lot
Yeah.
of people hate the term, and I understand why. Um, but there's something that's postmodernism, which is more sincere, which is rather than just deconstructing, wants to reconstruct. So we don't want to stop being critical, but we also want to reconstruct. Is emotionally places a lot of emphasis on emotional attunement, but also on having some interest in science, or being really guided by intellectual rigor at the same time. Seeing, intellectual rigor is a way of helping to design things. I mean, I always put this in a sense of, look, an artist, a really good engineer or architect is like an artist who is just has their imagination bounded by an understanding of physical reality. So they only imagine things like buildings that could stand up in the case of an architect, or machines or structures that could actually function in the case of an architect. Right? It's called, we call it a freeing constraint sometime, and it sounds paradoxical, but for an engineer or an architect, laws of physics are a freeing constraint. You go, and I have these laws, like I can freely imagine and make only things that would actually work if I actually, understand these things. They don't. in that case, the laws of physics are not seen as this, restraint on my, self, but it's kind of freeing, something that frees the imagination to explore, a really, interesting spaces, things, because things that don't work aren't very interesting, right? So,
So this
how do
integration of the yeah, so the integration of the mystical and reason is crucial, is what you're saying. We don't want to discard reason. We want to incorporate it as well as mysticism and the transrational into something
like a
as part of
creative,
this emerging.
a creative, an artist that you can say is, or the artistic impulses or the creative impulse, like the heights of human creativity are like having this sense of mystery, having, senses, being guided from some source which doesn't quite, is not really the egoic self, is not experience, we can say, is the egoic self, which seems like it's beyond us. We call it the large mind if you want. It doesn't, no need to get into that. But then, and then it kind of guiding the being guided, also using this sense of what we do know, right? So that we're using the materials they have, the things that we know how to change, but being guided to imagine within some type of space of possibility, uh creatively, right? So in the end, good engineering is a creative act. Good imagining of a different society is a creative act. We just haven't been doing it, right? There's a time
Yes.
in which that is going to have to happen again, and it's been clear that people have wanted to do that for the last, I'd say like 7 years that we really noticed it start happening. The
Yes.
podcast conversations started opening up. Things like Rebel Wisdom came around, and it was like really people looking outside of institutional spaces, not looking into academia because that's kind of sterile and doesn't really, yeah, it doesn't really seem to be life affirming. We can say, and looking for different perspectives, which are really, questioning everything and asking, okay, how do we live in this time, and so interested in everything from Jordan Peterson to, um, Joanna Macy, increased interest in Joanna Macy to, all sorts of uptick in spiritual interest over the last 10 years, I think is a symptom that people, want to live in a
Yes.
different kind of world. And now, but there's some work to do to do that. I think that statement that you wrote off was like, an early recognition on our part that, like, these, if you look at the history of historical movements, there's going to be a historical movement corresponding to when the kind of current capitalist paradigm falls apart, and it's going to have to be pretty, I mean, people hate this word, but like heroic is the only word, in order to be successful, because we haven't been doing so very well so far, right? Like, and I think the trick for me is like realizing like there's so many other people. You're incredibly small as a person, and there are lots of people who are silently having the same ideas out there, right? That's, what we've also found over the last 10 years is that, you know, I think part of the reason why we were early is because we knew each other. Like we happen to know, somebody else who thinks the same way, who's, wants to start something. So okay, well, do we want to start something? Yeah, fine. Let's do it, because at least we have collaborators and can get something off the ground. And now there's more and more people who, believe this. The broad have noticed the broad brushstrokes of what we've noticed and other people had noticed. I mean, and when you look back at history, we could talk all day about who has seen some of the things we're talking about and at what time. Like Hermann Hesse and the glass bead game is a really early example. That was a time when obviously it was just a work of fiction. It wasn't going to happen in his lifetime. Now we live in a, what's that?
Yeah, Sri Aurobindo. I mean, there's a variety of people. I mean, and then much more recently. I think there's one thing I want to kind of come to. So one is just to kind of wrap that up is to say people where that came to is like, okay, there's an emerging movement for this kind of change, and here are some of the features of it. I mean, we now to kind of have a more accessible naming. It's like metamodernism, I would say, is the name for the era. Like there's modernity, postmodernity, and then the second Renaissance or integral. There's many of these terms, or the great turning of Joanna Macy for this moment and this happening. I think what I also want to think is that what, at least at our end, I think the point you're making about this combination of the mystical and rigor is really important, and intellectual rigor. I mean, McGilchrist also makes it really well. And that's one of the things we also, maybe I don't think it's any way necessarily distinctive about life itself, but something we emphasize because one of the issues, um, we call ourselves pragmatic utopians, but often utopians get dismissed as kind of like stupid hippies. We live in an era where we're very cynical, but there is rightness about that. Like one of the reasons we want to be rigorous, and you said like good engineers are aware of the constraints of physics. If you want to create a new world, a new kind of society, you have to think about what are the constraints. And you also have to be correct of not taking too many constraints and not too little. And and the classic bad examples have been, at least maybe they were ahead of their time, whatever, but Marxist communism, didn't work out so well. And that's one of the things. And I think this is where I'm interested in collective action and the relationship of the things. Like you have to kind of think through one thing, because one way you can go is what I'd call the kind of mystical, like we just need to kind of sit on the cushion or like think the good thoughts or contemplate enough, and there'll just be the shift in worldview. We'll all come to love nature and realize how connected we all are, and like there's some truth in that, and it is powerful and important. Each of these things, and on the other end, there's this kind of what I would call the structural solutionist naivety of like, if only we all own the means of production, if only we implement blockchain, if only we all have citizens assemblies, whatever it is, some kind of governance thing, then we'll have this shift. And the answer, I think, again, there's truth that, of course, any major change will have shifts in governance and how we organize the economy and all those things. But the question is, what like you want to look back and you want to think kind of rigorously, like in our view is like, okay, what are the constraints? Well, most of things like institutions, you don't just need this individual insight, you need this kind of cultural shift and this worldview shift that then allows in kind of in tandem with institutional change to happen. And one of these things was about also the kind of problems that we saw in our society, um, like the ecological crisis, come back to collective action. And how have we solved collective action problems like that in the past? Well, we've had these kind of expansions in who we see ourselves to be. And I mention this, I guess, because there, there are, as I said, the other of the three, I would say, have some truth, but I think basically defective tendencies. One is the kind of mystical, we just need to meditate or see the nature connection. There's the structural solutionist, and the other is the techno solutionist, which is very dominant. People might say, I see the climate crisis, but what we need is to spend 100 million on a prize for carbon capture technology, or we need to electrify the grid, or we need to have more AI because that will allow us to work out the problems that we've been creating. And that one particularly is so attractive because it's this hack model. We don't have to go and address the hard things. We can kind of find a shortcut. We don't need to deal with this tendency to overconsume and want more and our materialism. And what we'll do is we'll invent some new technology that allows kind of infinite capture of energy from the sun or something like that. And this is something that I think relates back all the way to cognitive dissonance. And if I could, something we wanted to bring up was this example from Lord of the Rings that we talked about, this metaphor, which is you've seen Lord of the Rings or read it. There's this moment where they're trying to get to Mount Doom, and the Fellowship is together at this point. There's Gandalf leading, and there's Frodo and everyone, and they're trying to go over the pass. They're trying to go through the mountains of the snow. And there's this moment they're trying to get there, and then they have like Saruman is blocking them. He's sending stuff, and they have this moment where they're like, "Well, we can't make it through. It's too tough." Oh, and someone has this bright idea. There's a hack. we can go through the mountains. There's a way through, there's a secret passage the dwarves know about through the mountains, and this is a back way that doesn't mean we have to go through the snow and ice. And of course, this turns out to be a complete mistake. I mean, in the end, it works out because somehow Gandalf comes back from the dead. But basically, they meet the Balrog, and in normally any normal story, this would be game over. Your major player is taken out. Gandalf is killed by the Balrog. Somehow he gets resurrected. But essentially, this is a big tendency our society has today, which is we want to avoid collective action. We want to avoid the work of cultural I would say change, evolution to build a consciousness that could support planetary scale collective action that we might need, or even the local political action, you know. And instead, we want to go through the mountain. We think there's a shortcut. And I've even seen this. I grew up. I did a lot of work in technology, um, for good, if you like, about better technology for better democracy, technology for transparency. And there was this huge thing of like, well, we don't need to go and deal with like politics and parties and handing out leaflets and doing and building movements. We can build an app that will tell people, make them better informed about how they should vote, and then they won't vote for foolish people or whatever. And this huge tendency, and similarly you see this, I feel, around blockchain and Bitcoin, where irrespective of the people who are just in it for money, there's a whole bunch of people like, oh, this is this incredible force for good. We can use this new technology will allow us to solve the coordination problems that we have magically. And there's
Yeah.
this tendency to want this fairy dust rather than realizing I think that there's this hard work, but also to go back to the avalanche point, this hard work is not as hard as it may be. That cultural change can happen faster than we imagine because it's like an avalanche, because it's contagious, because we believe together. It's hard when you're 5%, but suddenly when you're about 20% or 30%, boom, you can kind of take over.
Exactly, and you need to look at the trends, right? So I mean, I think that's the thing that we need to. So I have a
Yeah.
upcoming report which will hit the, I don't know, the
Newsstands.
mainstream, yeah, has hit the newsstands, hit the internet in around January. We're gonna have a, an um opening launch with various people from the green movement, and it's about mobilizing majorities. And long story short, there's just, if you look at the trends and beliefs of you know climate change is a severe problem, uh both among, even among business people. So there's majorities of business people, there's majorities of people who also believe that they live in a collapsing society. And that was already true in 2020. I shudder to think what the numbers are now. um if you look at views about whether society matches their priorities, and also views about polarization, right? People think society's too polarized as well, and people recognize that rancor and division are also uh, part of a problem, right? When you put all those things together, and for various reasons, those issues are opinions are underrepresented. Um, in our discourse, like, obviously we sometimes hear things talking about, people talking about collapse. So people might say, oh, are we silent about collapse? I'm like, well, look, if 50% of people think that we could collapse in, our lifetime, and many of those are scientists, frankly, and we've got these, AI issues. If that's really the case, that we're looking at, like, the beginning of a massive civilizational decline, we shouldn't be talking about anything else, right? It's not like dominating discussions, right? Because it's a bit like death, like, like people who have health problems, or who are just going to die, sometimes talk about death because you can't avoid the subject. Uh, but they avoid it as much as you can. And I think, that's kind of like really our still publicly our attitudes towards collapse. But if you look at private polls in a disciplined way and look at faith in institutions, you find like really definite trends which say we're going towards a time in which paradigm shift is not only possible but almost inevitable. And we should just embrace that, right? Rather than saying, I mean, Bill Gates has, again, one of his lovely Gates notes, which he's shared with the world, where, he essentially says, don't worry about climate change. And, he says he doesn't say that, but he does say that, right? In total con contradiction to essentially scientific opinion, and particularly, the best scientific opinion.
Mm.
Uh, Right, and it's more technology because he's old guard. He's somebody who has this worldview which has worked very well in this old system. And basically he thinks it's going to continue forever, and that basically the world's going to continue to be pretty much the same. And in his world, collective action doesn't work. I mean, he explicitly says this, right? So the reason why he spent all of his so much money on energy breakthroughs is he recognizes sustainability is an issue, but he thinks the way to solve it is through tech, right? What people, um, you know, if you look down on his list of solutions, though, however, lists all these things as encouraging, but what he never really says is that you need government action to get most of them adopted on a wide scale, right? Like he's got these things in there. He's funded stuff which stops cows from producing methane if they take this stuff, right? But what farmer is going to do that unless the government asks them to, right? Like like they don't
Comes back to collective action. That's the crucial point.
action, right? So, and you could basically like, let's not talk about the need to go over the mountain. Let's just talk about the technology. If you read the, Bill Gates Race and Peace, it's this on a stick where he's basically in the really fine print. If you look at what he's saying, well, we need to go over the mountain, but it's going to be really easy, guys. He's trying to convince people that like, to take the first step by, somehow claiming, and that has been our people on climate change. There's two approach, which is, don't go over the mountain, just let's find technological hacks, or let's try to convince people to start go over the mountain by telling them it's going to be really easy. Meanwhile, people look at it and they're like, yeah, that's a pretty steep mountain, I don't believe you, and they just don't follow, right?
Yes. And this is a crucial point that, again, in terms of believing together, to come back, A, the intellectual rigor point, we need to be honest about we need collective action. Secondly, that acknowledging that it is maybe hard. But I think the other point is to say is having and faith, I guess I mean faith not in like a leap, but like, oh, we have overcome some things in the past. They do have this avalanche aspect, like collective action, where it's really, really hard and then suddenly it's possible.
Labor
As
movement, for
and as you
example.
just said, as I think there's 2 points. One is there's a growing sense that something's deeply the matter, which creates this kind of like the weight of snow on the mountain. I think the other thing that's important is the hope. That's what we're saying, the faith that we can have collective action. And in general, why at Life Itself, and in general, we both want to be like collapse honest or collapse aware or serious breakdown aware, and saying, listen, paradigm shift can happen and it can happen quite quickly and it can make a difference. And it might even be born out of a serious breakdown. It's not something we would like, but it may do. But I'm just saying, I think a couple of points there is just, as you say, being honest about collective action, but and emphasizing that it is possible. Look at these historical examples. The slave trade was never going to end. It did. Women were never going to get the vote or rights. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft, there she is, vindication of the rights of women in
Yeah, I mean,
1792.
even let's go to gay rights because that's something in our and trans rights. That's because that's like lifetime, right? Like,
Yeah.
the most compelling examples are sometimes the ones that we see in our lifetimes, right? Where it's like, when we were young, right? Trans people were essentially, non-humans, in the kind of public discourse. It was just something that, yeah, I mean, I'd say this most dehumanized group, and then, of course, it's become very politicized, but in a very short period of time, that's not really the attitude anymore. And not to say that it's everything's, great,
Rosie.
yeah, rosy and great for them, but it strides have been made, and gay rights and gay marriage is another one. I mean, 2000.
Right. So this point is so key articles, if you like, of the rational faith, but also a kind of is change can happen. That change can often originate also from things where people are deeply touched in their being, but change can happen. Change in views that underpin collective action. So as you say, like one of the points is let's say we want collective action on climate change, people acknowledging there's a serious issue, but also being shown there is a path forward are these two components that could unleash the snow on the mountain, or maybe, I don't know, in the positive sense, we want, I don't know if, what avalanches may be kind of dangerous, but this sense of this breakthrough that can happen, and that there is a sense that something is really shifting at the moment. Now, it's really difficult to call time. It might, maybe it will happen in the next decade, maybe it will be beyond our lifetimes, but one can see now the movement. And I think this point of this that we should be more honest about, we need to go over the mountain. That is collective action, and that is possible. There are ways that we can overcome the snow and Saruman. And that when there's enough of us, we're unconquerable in that aspect. And the question then, I guess, is how does one? I mean, which is maybe for our next. I don't really want to talk about it now, but this one of the reasons we've been doing this podcast, this aspect of spreading. Well, I mean, we both did economics at one point. So game theory. There's an aspect of both knowing something and knowing that others know something is
Mhm.
very important. So at the
Yeah.
moment, this aspect that not only am I feeling, oh wow, there's
Yeah,
something up here, but knowing that others know there's something up here is really important and crucial
well,
to.
that's exactly it, right? The thing is to advertise that. That's, essentially what this report will, you know, um, talk about. It's like we need collective efforts to break taboos, right? There's these things called the spiral of silence, right? Where uh, basically because people feel alone and that they can't make a change about an opinion, then they don't want to talk about it because what if I talk about my feelings about, say, gee, might collapse actually be possible? Well, what I'm going to do is force other people to talk about it and force myself to think about it. And neither of those are pleasant. They're all the more unpleasant when you don't think you can do anything about it, right? So you don't want to bother other people. Therefore, you don't say anything. Therefore, it looks like no one cares and you're alone because everybody's thinking the same way. Therefore, people get more silent and more their sense of collective efficacy gets lower, right? So
Yeah,
there's essentially, the kind of theory of change for climate majority project that we've always used is sort of this four-dimensional model of climate action, which is like, well, you need to know about reality. It's actually not the most important bit we anymore anyways, right? You need to have some sense of a role that you can play to be engaged. Like, how can I actually meaningfully do something about this? But then you also need the sense that other people are going to play their part if it's a massive endeavor, right? That you need a sense of being part of something large enough to make a difference. And then we need a sense of emotional stability when those first three conditions don't really work out very well, right? So at the beginning stages uh, of a movement to reverse this spiral of silence, right? For people to start expressing themselves publicly, you also probably need a sense of collective support, right? And so, and that's part of the sense of like, what do we actually need to do at this time is create the narrative and social infrastructure that make people feel part of a historically inevitable movement that changes that will eventually change things and create a real sense of support for people so that um, we're not intimidated into not talking about these things as we have been. And I think you know really, while we've not been talking about it, while these dynamics of silence have relative silence have dominated, the conditions for breaking the spiral, which is widespread private movement of opinions towards a direction where people don't think that they're living in a stable society and a society that works and that is capable of continuing is increased, right? Like polls are really strong on that. It's like something like 60 something 60% say the system is broken. Right. And then stronger, polls of that the system is unsustainable are higher than that. If you look at polls across countries, these are quite wide polls. I think that 60% is an Ipsos poll from, it was between 25 and 40 countries, right? This is like these are widespread beliefs. Faith in capitalism has gone down by 10 points in the last I forget 10 years, I think it is. I mean, there's quite a lot of erosion of faith. So, and I think that there is way too little uh, capacity or initiative in pointing to that and seeing that vacuum as a source of hope. It's like this is the vacuum we've been waiting for, right? What we need is to really get invested in that vacuum and create a real sense of trajectory from here to somewhere we really want to live in, right? Rather than only kind of only being reactive, right? There's like right now in say the UK, there's a upsurge in the Green Party, right? And there's a sense of like people are disaffected, so we'll talk about inequality, which is a good thing to be doing, talking about inequality and cost of living. Um, However, it probably needs to be part of a larger vision as well, right? So it probably ultimately needs to be part of something that's quite a bit broader than that. And it should be, right? So what we need really is like an overall vision of where we're going, which doesn't have to be perfectly precise, and the ability to translate into stuff, which would include, different, tackling inequality right now that would make a difference in people's lives, right? So a sense where we're going, we could say a philosophy, a governing philosophy, which cashes out into stuff that people care about and inspires them right now and has a number of steps from where we are, pragmatic steps from where we are to somewhere very different, right? If you have that sense and you can build that sense among a group of people, you can, I think, definitely break the spiral of silence right now and speak to the vast majority of people who have felt like alienated outsiders in their own society for, essentially our entire lifetimes.
Wow, yeah, I mean, you said it beautifully because I think that was one of the things and the core of life itself in our hypothesis we wrote back then was the development of a big vision and committed to powerful practical action to realize it, including the development of a large-scale social and political movement on the scale of our lifetime and those of our children. This what you just said, like that. One of the things that begins with vision. We live in an age of no vision or petty vision, and that to create these kind of program and to basically create this is a moment when large scale social and political movements with real hope and vision are both desperately needed and possible again um, after 50 or more years of if not longer of kind of sleeping. And as you said, it's time to reverse the spiral of silence. I think it's a great moment to end. Is there anything you want to say in checking out, Liam, for today to listeners you want to share as we end?
Well, I think it's also just to go back to that point, you had I've been was egging you on before we started to share the mountain metaphor, right? Get back to that. I think it's to really like maybe go over that again. I think that is the what we really need to look into that reality, right? That
Mm,
the what Tolkien's doing there in the Lord of the Rings is sort of this mythically true, right? He's a writer of something. He was writer of essentially a contemporary myth, he was trying to create a contemporary myth, and it's sort of mythically true because by trying to find this shortcut, they run into problems, and going over the mountain wasn't easy either, but it actually worked in the end, and it's I think you could make a quite it's easy to show that essentially government and collective action are our technology for solving coordinated problems and like coordination problems, right? Where like
Yes.
if we don't act together, then we can't really make the choices we want. You know, we can't make the socially optimal choice. We can't live in the world we all want unless we act in coordination together, right? And governments are coordination problem solving technology, right?
Yes.
You lost faith in governments, you've lost faith in solving coordination problems. If you can't solve coordination problems in a world of super technology, you're screwed. Like we're not gonna survive as a species without
Yes.
embracing politics. We have no chance of surviving as a species without doing something very differently in politics, right? And the kind of instability we may face will be a great chance for fascist groups to seize the wheel, as it were. And people just, I think we need to help each other create excitement about the political possibility again, right? So that
Yes.
we were talking about, like reaching silent, disaffected majorities and creating a conversation amongst the majority who is attracted to outsider aesthetics, right? I mean, what the hell is it when you've been living in this society where it's everybody's wanted to be an outsider, have a leather jacket, and kind of like spider tattoos for the longest time, right? Like, what is that? Well, it's basically like, this tear it down instinct, en masse because nobody feels that they're really in a system that serves their needs. And you can see this most in business. I won't go on, but read the report, right? Like 80% of people in business know we need new rules. Do you hear that from business people? No. Why? Well, because the lobbying power of corporations is mobilized for profits. It's not mobilized to express even what the biz people who run the corporations think or even who staff them, right? So the vast majority of business opinion is not actually reflected in corporate influence, right? The profit motive is expressed by corporate influence. And because we have institutions which fundamentally create incentives, they create the world in which we live in, the niche in which we live in, and kind of force us to act in order for our survival and in accordance with certain rules. Uh, you know, we're incapable of collective action while we don't recognize that dynamic and attempt in a collective coordinated way to break it. Right? There's only one way to break these dynamics, and it is through politics. There aren't other ways,
There
right?
is no hack exactly that way. Yeah, lies the Balrog. There is, and it wouldn't work. Like we have to, yeah, seize the nettle at the root, as it were. We have to go over the mountain. We have to do collective action, government politics, and that doesn't mean always classic party politics. It can be building social and political movements. I think of a pair. Was it a fierce blue fire from that book on the
Yeah,
climate? But we need movement building. There's no other way around it. And this tendency to be, oh, but maybe we can build a piece of tech. Maybe we can do it. We go and leave on a seasteading or like whatever the frick it is. Delusion about ways that we can create hacks. It distracts us from the real work. Um, yeah, yes,
yeah,
we. Let's,
yeah. We need to do politics. We need, and it's a cultural slash political. So it's not. We're not saying
yeah,
stop meditating. I was at Plum Village just recently, which is a Zen monastery. We're active in meditation. I mean, I I find that incredibly important. However, um, in order to, as we touched on earlier, in order to create a society where it's possible to spend some time to live in accordance with our better nature, we need to change the rules at the same time. So those two things go together. It's not one.
What fundamentally does it say? So the question is, let's say you're trying to go over the mountain. Maybe we can run with the metaphor. And they're there, and the Saruman's sending the wind, and so on. The thing that you get is like, oh well, we haven't got a majority. So when we say politics, underneath politics is views and values, is what we believe. I mean, one of which is just even believing in the importance of collective action in politics. But what I'm saying is, underneath that, it's like you're trying to get legal slavery stopped. Well, fundamentally, yes, ultimately you'll pass a law in Parliament, but that's underpinned by a shift in culture, and that in itself is underpinned by ontological shifts that come about via meditation, psychedelics, just integration with other people. I mean, maybe it would end as I think, people's worldview shift in odd ways. I remember reading this beautiful book called Red Hill, which is by Tony Parker about the mining community after the miners' strike in the 1980s. And the thing that struck me was about a woman who, she had first kid at 17 or 18. She's married to a miner. She's left school at 16. She's not very educated. But during the miners' strike, there's this moment where her husband's home and she's coming back from now working to support them, and he hasn't cooked anything and he's got beer cans out. And she's like, okay, you're going to cook the dinner. And there's this breakthrough basically in her worldview. There's a moment where she's suddenly, in a way, becomes more empowered as a woman, even in this disastrous moment for them and their community. And those then underpin her becoming politically engaged and socially active. And that, so we really want to emphasize that when we say we need to go over the mountain, underpinning that is the cultural shift and the changes in views and values, and changing the spiral of silence. Just as in a society that was ruled over by authoritarian structure, there's this growing sense of like we're all thinking it doesn't work, but there's a moment where that needs to break through into cultural consciousness, and then it comes into political action. And these things are in tandem. And the other thing I want to maybe, now that we're just riffing this point, is the prefigurative nature of politics. One reason also to engage in politics at the moment, even if you knew you were nowhere near a majority, is that is one way of breaking and conventional politics in a way is his way of addressing the spiral of silence, because politics is visible. And we live in an age of such emaciated politics where what I mean by politics even here is collective vision, a willingness to say, this is a vision for what we want. Because we live in an era where we say, don't tell me what I want, just tell me I can get more GDP. No, there is a vision of the good life and what is
Yeah.
reasonable. And it's not like there's one, or I'm to say it for everyone, or you are, or anyone else is. But there's actually a great deal of shared view about what the good life is across the world, I think, about across humanity, but certainly within many nations and cultures, which has become almost dormant. And so, yeah, this is just crucial to emphasize that we want to go over the mountain. And one crucial aspect of that is politics and collective action. And underpinning that is cultural and ontological change, shifts in consciousness.
Yeah. Well, and those things go together, right? Because if we had political changes, it would be easier for more people to live
Yes,
right lives, or I mean,
exactly. The structural changes then support. I
yeah,
mean, it goes back to our diagram of like pioneering the culture and transforming the narrative. We need to transform the narrative.
yeah. I mean,
So,
is social media good for children's ability to live with a quiet mind? No, obviously not, right? So, I mean, not to go. I think we should end, but
yeah.
I mean, like Thich Nhat Hanh had this statement that people have thrown around a million times, right? The next enlightened being might be a sangha. Now, the point that he was making there was that it took a sangha to allow the conditions of quietness that, like, people who come from Eastern traditions and spend a lot of time in the West, like, wow, this is just so much grasping mind. Like the mind's just so addicted to being able to grasp what they want, right? To having the pleasures in front of them that achieve this like silence of mind. is very difficult except in like a very like intentionally created social context, right? So I mean, creating those contexts can be done through small groups, but obviously the difficulty of the macro context is partially due to politics, or it's very clearly has a lot to do with politics and laws and the economic system, and so you just cannot treat those things as different at all. And we just much less this, not that, about this. Oh, is it personal or is it political or is it
They're
private?
intertwined. They're
Yes. The answer is yes. Yes, it is. It's both. Those things are not distinct, right? So,
yeah. Yeah, the personal, they interbe,
yeah.
and we need the whole system change. That's a great point to end on. Thank you very much. And there'll be, I think we're gonna, if we hopefully do these regularly, so tune in for the next episode of this with Liam and I. Thank you so much. Any last words from you, Liam?
Oh, that's it. I'm fine. That's more than enough.